Hi everyone, my name is Ava Gamble, and today I'm presenting my Keystone Project, A Welfare State for the Wealthy, the 1949 Federal Housing Act. Before I continue, I want to thank my advisor, Professor Anderson, for being so committed to my academic pursuits the past 3 semesters, and also putting up with me for all of that time as well, and also the West End Museum for so graciously welcoming me into their community and their unwavering support for my research. The 1949 Federal Housing Act, which I'm going to be referring to as the FHA for the purpose of this presentation, notoriously on July 15th of 1949, was announced by President Truman as he had signed his approval into law. In his address, he famously said that the FHA established a decent home and a suitable living environment for every American family. By the early 60s, it was apparent to the public and the private sector that Truman's dream was not actualized, and the 1949 FHA had begun to illustrate signs of failure. By March of 1961, 126,000 residential units had been demolished and about 28,000 new units were built. The median monthly rent of all housing erected during 1960 came out to $158, and then in 1962 it was $192, which sounds like a pretty good deal. And then accounting for inflation, that was $2,020, which also kind of sounds like a pretty good deal for Boston. But that compared with the median rent of the low-income working-class neighborhood, which I'll be explaining later on in my presentation, was $25 a month. So there was a pretty big jump there. 60% of dispossessed tenants were forced into housing, just as substandard or more substandard than their former homes, and only 0.5% of federal expenditures for urban renewal between 1949 and 1964 were spent on the relocation of families and individuals. For the purpose of illustrating the failures, or what I've deemed the failures of the Federal Urban Renewal Project, I've decided to investigate the West End, not only because it's considered the nation's seminal urban renewal blunder, but also because it's very close to Boston. And I found it extremely important upon discovering that 12,000 people had been displaced from the West End in the 50s under this program, that I understand it as a transient student in Boston, as the city tends to get the reputation that the students come and go. But despite the West End being demolished, there is a very well-remembered and memorialized rich history of its cultural significance and built environment. And that's something that I want to pay tribute to, but also illustrate the struggles that these people endured in order to understand how harmful the Federal Urban Renewal Act was for low-income immigrant working-class families in the United States. The premise of Title I of the FHA, which is the section of the legislation that incentivized widespread wholesale demolition of immigrant neighborhoods, was responsible for dispensing loans to local municipalities in order for them to finance their clearance projects. After that, 2/3 of all of the net incurred costs of clearance would have been repaid back to these local municipalities. However, there was no federal funding allocated to the redevelopment of these projects, nor were there any legal parameters enforcing low-income housing be built on these project areas. Therefore, for all intents and purposes, we can, or I have inferred, that the Federal Housing Act was a clearance project. In my research, I determined that the FHA's failure was a result of grave missteps of the federal, state, local, and private powers. However, my historical analysis slightly deviates from widespread understanding of why the urban renewal program failed according to so many entities, and I argue that the agency afforded to private developers and the existence of profit incentive in creating luxury apartments and commercial spaces on top of these project areas is what was central to the disintegration and failure of the program. I used Charles River Park, which is pictured here. That is the luxury apartment complex that was built on top of the demolished West End project area in order to illustrate the role that private developers played in the failure of the project. What you're looking at here is a before and after of the demolished West End neighborhood. It was a tight-knit, mixed-use, fine-grained retail on the bottom, which I love, city with primarily Jewish and Italian immigrants. And it was designated obsolete, which was language employed by cities and the federal government in order to determine that a neighborhood could not be salvaged unless it was completely demolished, whether or not there were people in the neighborhood who said otherwise. So the project area was seized under eminent domain in 1958 and then demolished shortly after. And like I mentioned, more than 12,000 people were displaced. And later into the 60s, even more project area was seized and encroached upon the neighborhood. Charles River Park Incorporated was the private developer responsible for building the luxury apartments on top of the West End. Jeremy Rappaport, an attorney and politically favorable figure in Boston, represented Charles River Park. Preliminary construction of the West End project area was exclusively luxury apartments, which was technically a part of the West End project. However, a specific acreage was meant to be allocated to low-income housing in order to relocate the West Enders who had been dispossessed, as promised when they were dispossessed. However, Jeremy Rappaport fought tooth and nail to make sure this didn't happen, between back and forth lawsuits with the BRA and other the BRA, the Boston Redevelopment Authority, the City Council, and other private enterprises in order to keep elderly housing and low-income housing out. Eventually, the last 10 acres of the West End were developed, but not until 16 years after the original project demolition, because Rappaport needed to strike a deal with the Boston Redevelopment Authority in order to get the last of his luxury apartments up. This is an advertisement for Charles River Park and includes some of the rents. I want to call your attention back to the $25 a month that West Enders were paying for rent before they were forcibly displaced from their neighborhoods. It goes without saying that there was no possibility for them to return to their demolished homes. I don't want to end this presentation on a note as negative as that, so I do want to add that the demolition of the West End, while this was, too heavy of a sacrifice, incentivized other neighborhoods in Boston that were on the chopping block for urban renewal due to being deemed as obsolete to organize very strong political fronts in order to protect their neighborhoods. And that's why we have the Beacon Hill Civic Association, that's why we have the North End, which we know is an epicenter of Boston tourism and culture, and it's why we have the South End too. Additionally, the West End Museum has done a tremendous job of rekindling and cultivating community in the West End, although it looks completely different. There are a couple of older West Enders that come in from time to time and talk, and it's really nice. Thank you.
So after the demolition and the creation of the Charles River Park apartments, you said, so where did the original inhabitants of West End kind of go? Did they go to specific neighborhoods in Boston? Did they leave the city?
Yeah, they went to Dorchester and Roxbury primarily, which is it's a part of the changing arrival neighborhoods in Boston. The West End was actually also a primarily black neighborhood before it was an immigrant and working class neighborhood. So all of these neighborhoods that were designated as obsolete based on the federal urban renewal program were kind of just like a revolving door for immigrants and working class people and Black people who were being pushed out. And ultimately, when they did move to Dorchester and Roxbury, they ended up paying like double what they were paying in the West End, and also were living in homes that were also designated as obsolete.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Ava, this is great. What do you think is like the most salient place for us to apply these lessons today, like whether policies or something happening in the city?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that the legacy of the FHA has drastically changed the way that we approach urban planning, and it's pretty popular within the urban planning community, especially in Boston, to acknowledge these projects, because I didn't mention this, but the program at large displaced like 1.36 million people and 300,000 familial households. So we are pretty committed to not raising neighborhoods anymore, and it doesn't happen. It goes by like a city-by-city basis, obviously, because local municipalities are in charge of their preservation projects, and the federal government isn't really involved in that kind of thing anymore. But you know, I think that the main takeaway is like community-oriented planning and bottom-up urban renewal rather than top-down urban renewal. Paying attention to the communal needs of people and revitalizing based on what they want and need.
Anyone else?
Ava, this is awesome. Because your project has also a history component, I was just curious if you could tell us something about how does what you have studied with the West End, how does that compare with what happened across the nation? Is it pretty similar in terms of the kinds of rationale that were used, et cetera? Thank you.
Yeah, so to contextualize this, it's post-World War II GI Bill, white flight is occurring en masse, and cities are trying to lure white Americans and white families back into the city. And they're also in financial crisis, particularly in Boston, but all across the United States, because the FHA, in addition to, I wish that I was able to talk about every single detail of it, but Title III also streamlined federal loans and made suburban homes much more accessible for not only veteran families, but US families at large. So this is widely a result of American cities wanting to bring white families back in, and these downtown immigrant or diverse working class neighborhoods in general, you know, they were like tarnishing the reputation of the financial epicenters of these cities. So at large, you know, there was a city beautification movement. There was the demonization and villainization of these slums in the name of public health. And I would say that for the most part, the historical analysis remains consistent across most of these cities. There were some urban renewal successes. I didn't really dedicate time to them, but you know, I talk about them in my full-length paper. So you know, this exact scenario didn't play out everywhere, but we just recognize it as the most harmful, and it's the most popular. Yeah.
Thank you, Ava. Great job.